The massacre at Wounded Knee was an important chapter of American history. It ended the Indian Wars that led to the marginalization of Native cultural traditions and began the assimilation campaigns of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. This created an environment of oppression on American Indian reservations that would not be challenged until the 1970s. To understand this turning point in Native American history, it is necessary to understand some of the background of the event. In the upper central part of what is now America, there lived a band of Native people. They called themselves Lakota. They were a peaceful people for the most part, only the occasional dispute, and they respected the land and nature. This peace did not, however, last forever. European settlers needed to expand their farmland to make a living, so they took the natives' land as their own. At first the Lakota were hospitable and allowed them to take the land, but tensions sprang up, and the natives, who had been pushed too hard, decided that they could not take it anymore. This was the start of the Indian Wars. They were bloody, with atrocities on both sides, and with many double crossings and backstabbings. The Lakota did not fight in the Indian Wars in the beginning, but they did in the late 1860s. One of the reasons that they did get involved was because of the buffalo, which is their main source of food and shelter. They were being killed off by white Americans, and so many were killed that by 1889 there were less than 1,000 left. And so the Lakota decided to fight in the Indian Wars. Perhaps one of the most famous of conflicts was the Battle of the Little Bighorn, commonly known as Custer's Last Stand. There were two famous commanders, Custer for the Americans and Crazy Horse for the Lakota. Custer was killed in the fight, but Crazy Horse survived. He was a fearless warrior, but in 1877 his people needed him to surrender, and so he did. The Americans took him as prisoner and literally stabbed him in the back with a bayonet. But Crazy Horse had surrendered, and so the Americans had no reason to treat him as hostile. The natives mourned their loss, but all the while, tensions remained high, especially with the changing of Oglala Lakota culture.
In the late 19th century, an American Indian religious movement called the Ghost Dance emerged from Nevada. A Paiute named Wavaka, also known as Jack Wilson, foretold the faith of the new religion as an attempt to revitalize traditional culture. He claimed that soon the earth would be renewed, and with it, the white race will be condemned, while Indians regained their prosperity. Within a year, the ghost dance spread to the western tribes. Due to misinterpretations and concerns of rebellion, the Bureau of Indian Affairs banned the ghost dance to protect the white settlers living nearby Indian reservations. The warrior chief of the Sioux tribe, Sitting Bull, was killed on December 15, 1890, while resisting arrest for the offense of adopting the ghost dance religion. The Sioux tribe was then led to the Pine Ridge Reservation by their new chief, Bigfoot, in search of refuge from the military. On December 28th, the 7th Cavalry apprehended and escorted the tribe 16 miles northeast to the banks of Wounded Knee, South Dakota, where they camped for the night. On the morning of December 29, 1890, the U.S. troops advanced upon the Sioux camp to arrest Chief Bigfoot and relieve the warriors of their weapons. The 500 troops surrounded the tribe, carefully organizing groups of artillerymen to train their Hotchkiss machine guns upon the encampment below. Tensions were high between the troops and the Sioux tribe, who still grieved the loss of Sitting Bull. A deaf tribesman named Black Coyote refused to give up his rifle to the troops, and the argument turned into a violent scuffle. During the course of the fighting, the Black Coyote's rifle was discharged and its reverberating noise was heard throughout the camp. The situation quickly escalated as the soldiers retaliated with open fire, and the warriors tried to secure their weapons. But few of the Indians had arms, and they were forced to flee, only to be gunned down by the rapid fire of the Hotchkiss machine guns that were situated nearby. Without hesitation, the artillerymen unloaded fire upon the Native Americans with no regards towards age nor gender. When the assault subsided on the snow-covered open plains of Wounded Knee battlefield, groups of soldiers searched for survivors. 153 Indians out of the original 350 died from severe wounds or hypothermia, including Chief Bigfoot. At least 50 Indians were discovered wounded, some of which died later. The soldiers only suffered casualties of 25 men, and the majority of these incidents occurred because of friendly fire. 20 of the soldiers also received medals of honor for their actions in the massacre. The soldiers loaded up the surviving wounded in wagons that sat in the bitter cold while an officer searched for shelter. They were finally taken in by a church whose Christmas banner still hung from the rafters, reading "Peace on Earth, Goodwill to Men." On New Year's Day, the burial crew came to Wounded Knee to dispose of the frozen dead bodies in a mass grave. The mass grave later became a landmark memorial in South Dakota.
The Wounded Knee Massacre ended the Indian Wars in the West. When the 7th Cavalry buried Bigfoot's band, they effectively conquered the Great Plains for the federal government and confined the tribes to reservations. The reservation system was almost completely under the control of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. The BIA hoped that, with education, Native Americans would be assimilated into larger American society as immigrant groups had been. To this end, they created the Indian schools. The most famous was the Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania, where almost 1/10 of students were Lakota. It was based on the principle of assimilation through total immersion, that is, training the children for labor and service jobs. The motto was, "Kill the Indian to save the man." Boys had to cut their long hair, something the Lakota had traditionally done only when mourning a relative, and all Native children were forbidden to speak their own languages or practice their traditional religions. Many of the schools were guilty of mental, physical, and sexual abuse, and students died of diseases because they had few immunities. By the 1960s, the Indian schools had mostly eradicated Native culture. In the early 70s, the American Indian movement tried to revive it. Its membership, mostly urban Indians, protested the treatment they had received from the BIA and the federal government. They also agitated for the removal of Dick Wilson, tribal chairman of Pine Ridge. Wilson, a part-blood Lakota, was the kind of Indian the BIA wanted, assimilated and Americanized. He was also guilty of intimidation and cronyism. After the tribe failed to impeach him for the second time, Lakota elder Frank Foolscrow told the AIM to go to Wounded Knee. In late February of 1973, hundreds of activists drove to the site of the historic massacre. They held the small town of Wounded Knee hostage for 72 days. The FBI and the United States Marshal Service tried to break the siege. Though the siege of Wounded Knee was much less appalling than the massacre, death tolls are disputed but appear to be no higher than 4, it brought Native American issues closer to the national forefront. The world of the Lakota would never be the same as before the massacre, but the AIM gave the tribe a little more credibility. Today, the Lakota have successfully defended their sacred site of Bear Butte from commercial development and are gradually buying back parts of their holy land, South Dakota's Black Hills.